Greetings everybody and welcome. It is the evening of the 25th of August 2024 and we are coming to you today with the second part of our dealing with the events of August 19th to 21st, 1991 and the final few months of the existence of the Soviet Union. And I'm going to sketch out some of what happened after August 1991 and what caused the final collapse and the final victory of, or perhaps I should say the temporary victory of the counter-revolution, which saw the dissolution of the USSR at the end of December 1991. Now, last night we covered the events of August 19th to the 21st and the backgrounds to them. I contested the point of view of bourgeois historians and journalists that this was a coup by hardline communists. As you'll know, if you've studied anything about this period, the likes of Yanayev were no more hardline communists than really the likes of Neil Kinnock were. These were, at the very most, men who were social democrats. They were not they weren't Marxists, or never mind Marxist-Leninists. They weren't revolutionaries. They were functionaries, creatures really of Gorbachev himself. So the hardline communists is the very opposite of what they were. What they did represent was the faction gathered around Mikhail Gorbachev himself, which wanted a transition to a form of state capitalism, actual state capitalism, not the garbage theory dreamed up by the British Trotskyite Tony Cliff in the 1940s. And they wanted to keep a version of the USSR together. This is the point of view of what I will refer to as the emergent national bourgeois. And it's this group that is entered into a bitter contest with what I'll call the comprador group that surrounded Boris Yeltsin. Now, in last night's program, I also put forward the point of view that is taken from Kieran and Kenny in their book Socialism Betrayed, but also relies on testimony from Russian sources, including the former vice president of the Russian Federation, Alexander Rutskoy, who'd been an ally of Yeltsin, later turned against him in the events of Black October. And multiple sources posit the idea, including also Yanayev himself, who was Gorbachev's vice president. Again, multiple sources will have insisted that Gorbachev was the ninth man in the GKHCP, the State Committee on the State of Emergency. And he was meant to join it and didn't, for reasons that I would love to know more about. If there are any sources out there in Russian on this, I would love to read more about it. But for reasons that are undisclosed or unknown to us at this time, but we can only speculate about, Gorbachev failed to join them. It might not even have worked had Gorbachev joined them, because Gorbachev at that stage, any popularity that he might have had in 85 or 86 had long since vanished. And the advantage was with, at that stage, the comprador Russian bourgeois around Boris Yeltsin. And the favor of imperialism passed from Gorbachev to Yeltsin, because it was going to be Yeltsin that carried through the next and final stage of the counter-revolution. The imperialists had backed Gorbachev because they correctly, from their point of view, identified him as a man who was systematically dismantling the Soviet system. Because that is what he was doing. There is a great debate as to whether he was an asset of a foreign intelligence service or not, or whether he was just developed this rotten and rancid revisionist point of view that ultimately culminated in liquidationism. That debate rumbles on. I've seen sources from various people, various organizations in Russia, who claim that Gorbachev was recruited into foreign service in the CIA, in the 50s. I think there's a good case to be made that his head of propaganda, Alexander Yakovlev, may well have been recruited into the CIA or become an asset of the American imperialists when he was actually in the United States in the 1950s. So there's a decent argument to say that he was. There's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, to use a very English phrase, with regard to Gorbachev. But whether he was a direct asset of a foreign intelligence service or just a wretched tail-ender revisionist, the effect was the same, which is that he systematically destroyed the remaining aspects of proletarian power in the USSR. And to be brief about this starts with essentially Khrushchev in 1956 with the so-called secret speech, which was not secret. Again, this was a speech where he didn't just denounce Stalin. He denounced Stalin directly to the imperialists. And what that that isn't just Khrushchev denouncing Stalin. That's much more about the revisionists in the Soviet Union, the counter-revolutionary bourgeois elements in the party itself, declaring to the imperialists that they are no longer interested at all in revolution. In actual fact, they'd like to reach an accommodation with the imperialists. Now, at that stage, and in fact through the Khrushchev and Brezhnev period, there were still enough revolutionaries inside the Soviet party to get in the way of that. And this remained the case up until the early 1980s. However, the work of the revisionist clique was relentless in trying many times to restore capitalism in various different ways. And this continued all the way through the 60s and the 70s. They were blocked at various different occasions, but they were very determined that the working class's role in governing the country should be relegated, that the working class should be depoliticized. This is part of the reason why they promoted consumerism in the Soviet Union. Now, here I want to make a point about socialism and consumer goods. It is not the case that I am here to make to you that socialism will deny the working class furniture or decent housing. In fact, I think that the housing of the working class should be an absolute priority, and it should be exemplary. It should be housing befitting of the class that rules society. It wasn't the case in terms of the things that Khrushchev built. They looked like council flats in Britain, and just on a bigger scale, and they were designed by a bourgeois architect from France. That was hardly an example of socialist construction, not really. It was more like a bourgeois construction, but again on a bigger scale. Now, what the revisionists were determined to do was to essentially buy off the masses, depoliticize them, keep them out of the state structures, make sure that they were only concerned with meeting production quotas, which of course is important, but you need, if socialism is to survive and grow into communism, you need to be consistently politicizing the working class, raising up as many workers as possible into the vanguard party and into key positions in the state. Now, what was happening in the CPSU was the opposite. So there was a slow process of the party being, in terms of its membership, becoming more and more bureaucratized and more taken over by the so-called intelligentsia, or really the nomenklatura, to use the Soviet word. There was still, though, a big section of the party that consisted of workers, honest communist workers. And it is this section that Gorbachev and his handlers, let's just say that, people like Yakovlev, were most determined to carry through the counter-revolution against. That's why Gorbachev launched so many attacks on the party and on the Soviet system, because the working class, though its power in the system had diminished and been diminished by Khrushchev, by the Brezhnev era, and into the early 1980s and the brief reigns of Andropov and Chernenko, under whom there were still contradictory processes going on. But Gorbachev's rise represents the triumph of the most aggressive counter-revolutionaries who, from 85 to about 89, worked together to destroy the remaining elements of proletarian democracy, all of course, in the name of democracy. What they mean by democracy is, of course, bourgeois democracy, and what they meant by really glasnost and perestroika was, in terms of openness, was trashing all the previous achievements of socialism and trying to destroy them, using the state propaganda system against socialism, and trying to make the case to dismantle the remaining elements of proletarian democracy that remained active in the Soviet system, replacing it with bourgeois democratic institutions such as the so-called Congress of People's Deputies, and removing the role of the CPSU as the leading force in Soviet society. All of that was done after 1988 to 89. So by the time we reach 1991, the party's role has been relegated. But that's still not enough, because the party is still capable, and was still capable, of mobilizing potentially millions and millions of workers to oppose the pro-capitalist clique. And that was a risk they didn't want to take. Gorbachev was determined to concentrate power in an executive presidency that was run by him, but he was outmaneuvered. He was outmaneuvered by the Comprador clique, who had identified the Yeltsin as their vessel. Yeltsin, I will maintain, had no real ideas of his own. He was just a sort of bombastic, empty vessel for who was to be filled with the ideas of people like Anatoly Sobchak, or the American imperialists. And his triumph in the election in 1990 to elevate him to become president of Russia, of the RSFSR, was a triumph in vagueness. He was running against an unpopular pro-Gorbachev hack named Rizkov, who was not as bad as Gorbachev, but was implicated in a lot of Gorbachev's more disastrous policies. It was Rizkov who wrote the law, or whose name was on the law, allowing the first mass privatizations, and he was associated with that. Now, Yeltsin demagogically made all promises to all people. He presented himself as being literally the embodiment of all things to everybody. If you wanted freedom, democracy, restoration of capitalism, he was, well, your guy most definitely. But he never really presented himself that way. He talked in the terms of his handlers, which is renewal, democracy, freedom, empowering the individual, those kind of things. The worker will be better rewarded than ever before once we chase out the bureaucracy and get rid of the Communist Party, get rid of the remaining elements of the Soviet system. I'm the guy to do it. He tapped into all the frustration that had been accumulated thanks to Gorbachev's failed pro-capitalist reforms, and got a mandate that was based on, again, vague aspirations and a deliberately non-committal policy agenda, though in reality his agenda was quite clear. Now, the counter-revolution was clearly gathering pace, and here we will pause just briefly to ask the question, well, it certainly couldn't have been stopped by the likes of Gennady Yanayev, Boris Pugo, and the others in the GKHCP. So what could have stopped it? Yeah, I mean, we covered last night the fact that decisive action from the forces of the state in 1989 to 90 could have wrapped up the counter-revolutionaries and done what the Chinese did, chucked Yeltsin and the other conspirators in prison, basically done a security clampdown across the country, and stopped the secessionist movements. That could have been done maybe as late as 1990, or even perhaps with the right leadership in 1991, but that was never done. The reason why the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union succeeds fundamentally is that no one ever seriously opposed it until it was too late. You see Yeltsin, when the initiative passes to him, and it does so after he wins the election in 1990, as an article in Gazeta Pravda recently pointed out, Yeltsin then started creating all kinds of new positions in the RSFSR that have nothing to do with the Soviet constitution under which he was elected, have nothing to do with the law of either the RSFSR or the USSR. He creates like mayoralty posts. He mirrors all kinds of bourgeois systems imported directly from the West. Was it his idea? No, I'm going to say it was probably Sobchak's idea, and he was taking the ideas probably from the US imperialists themselves. So he creates all these rival structures to drain power away from the Soviet system. Why? Because he knows, or his handlers know, that they can't use the system as it is currently constituted, because the system in the RSFSR was still based nominally on the power of the local Soviets. And this is actually what built the rebellion which culminated in the events of Black October in 1993. The Supreme Soviet of the Russian Federation, as it became, was still drawn from deputies taken from working class areas in Russia. And so it was a big potential barrier, as were all the local Soviets were potential barriers to the destruction of the planned economy and the mass privatizations that the Yeltsin clique had in mind. So they had to build new legal structures to go around the remaining elements of working class power. So that's what they were doing. And all of Yeltsin's presidency is like this, where from 1990 all the way up to, well, he gets disempowered pretty much by 98. He's pretty much finished. But for 8 years, this is what he does, especially in the early period. He never passes these laws in a democratic fashion. He keeps screaming about democracy and freedom, where in actual fact what he's doing is he's carrying through a counter-revolution against the working class. He's building bureaucratic structures to privatize things by administrative fiat. That's what he's doing, while screaming about democracy. If this is all sounding very familiar to you, it's because this is basically the textbook example of like counter-revolution or color revolution that has been run by the USA, US imperialism, ever since. So again, like I'll come back to the democracy point later on, but the point about Yeltsin is that this is what he's already carrying through this bureaucratic counter-revolution. And at each stage, though there are demonstrations against this, though there are millions of people who vote in the March 1991 referendum to retain the USSR, there's never a moment when the opposition to him, to either Gorbachev, both Gorbachev and Yeltsin, mobilizes in a serious way. And the will was certainly there amongst the masses, but again, here we get into an unfortunate legacy. There was no leader. There might have been people with the potential to lead, but the honest communists, of whom there were millions in the USSR, were looking to leadership to do something. They were looking to their local leaders, who were looking to the regional leaders, who were looking to the republic leaders. Now, all the republic leaders had gone rotten by this stage. I don't think there was a decent one left amongst them. I think the last ones were probably some of the guys who ran Ukraine prior to Kravchuk, but Gorbachev forced them out. And the Central Asian republics, places like Azerbaijan, were all run by either very weak characters or very corrupt characters like Nursultan Nazarbayev and others. So what happened was the very visible manifestation of the effects of revisionism, which is that not only is it the case that the leaders have consciously attempted to depoliticize and demobilize the masses and claim that class struggle no longer existed in the USSR, which is one of Khrushchev's claims and maintained by Brezhnev and others. This is a very bureaucratic point of view. And they consciously made a decision to consciously depoliticize the working class and demobilize it, meaning that by the time you get to 1991, there's no one in place really in the mid-ranks of the CPSU where new leaders could emerge from. There's very few people who could, who were prepared to or had the political capabilities and organizational capabilities to actually say, look, we are facing a full-blooded counter-revolution, and it's going to be create merry hell for the working class. The country's going to get destroyed. Urgent action is needed, meaning the workers need to mobilize. There needs to be a mobilization. I mean, I'm going into speculative field here, but if there'd been a mobilization from the middle layers of the CPSU, using the organizational network of the CPSU, calling out to workers everywhere to say, look, Yeltsin is a thief, the others are thieves, him and Gorbachev are out to destroy the country and steal everything. We need to mobilize and go on a general strike to defend the country, to defend socialism now. Could that have succeeded? I don't know, but that was the kind of thing that would have needed to have happened. You would have needed to have a general strike across the country, not against the overthrow of the system, but for the blocking of the counter-revolution and for the overthrow of both Yeltsin and Gorbachev. But again, even though a lot of people knew that that was what was needed, no leadership emerged capable of doing it. And so what you ended up with is leaderless movements going nowhere, until eventually there was a blow-up in 1993, which fell into the hands of people like Rutskoy and others who were, again, former allies of Yeltsin who had been pushed into revolt by Yeltsin's sheer criminality and the mass opposition it generated, but who had no real interest in actually overthrowing Yeltsin. They were pushed into a rebellion that they didn't want to do. So, after the failure of the GKHCP and the arrest of its leadership, though it should be said that most of the leaders that survived, people like Yanayev, they got a couple of years in prison, not a great deal more than that. In fact, some of them went on to quite lucrative careers inside the new state structure of the Russian Federation. So again, like, clearly a deal was done there to cut them loose. Clearly they weren't the enemies of Yeltsin, or Yeltsin felt like he could be magnanimous at that stage. So after August 21st, what happens? First of all, the Gorbachev resigns as General Secretary of the CPSU. He should have been removed as early as 87 in my view, but there you go. And the CPSU itself is made illegal. So the party has gone from, at the beginning of 1989, being the leading force in Soviet society as it had been since 1917, to being removed from that position, but incidentally still winning the majority in the Congress of People's Deputies in the first bourgeois election organized by Gorbachev, to being illegal inside 2 years. Its property, which was vast, was seized by various people associated with the Yeltsin clique. Its funds were looted. People who tried to track its funds down were killed. Many people who knew where the bodies were buried, so to speak, were eliminated by various characters who remain unknown. And the party of Lenin is no more. And that all happened, well, with some shots being fired, but again, with no serious resistance being waged. And again, we come back to the point that it was not that the Soviet people, whether be they Russian, Ukrainian, Azerbaijani, Kazakh, Uzbek, Tajik, Kyrgyz, actually wanted any of this. Where they got to vote, they voted for the Communist Party, and they voted, even in Gorbachev's elections, and they voted to retain the Soviet system. So what triumphed in 91 was the will of, at most, around about 20% of the population, mostly Ukrainian and Russian, it must be said. Those were the two big separatists. Yeltsin was the leading separatist. So now the Communist Party is no more. It has been made illegal. The whole millions of communists across the country now have no party to call their own and have been branded criminals. And so from that point onwards, it really is just a matter of time before the whole thing just falls to pieces or is brought down. It is eventually dissolved by a notorious event called the Belavezha Accords, which was a treaty signed by the leaders of the constituent republics. So that's Stanislav Shishkevich of Belarus, now deservedly forgotten, Yeltsin himself, and Kravchuk, Leonid Kravchuk, the president of the Ukrainian SSR. So this was the final end, because what they did was the three of the four states who had signed the 1922 Declaration on the Creation of the USSR. So that was signed originally by Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia, the Transcaucasian SFSR. So that had now that long since ceased to exist. But three of those four states, their leadership came together and repealed the 1922 treaty. Now, again, that was done completely at odds with all the laws that Yeltsin, Sheshkovich, Kravchuk, and all the others who signed that were bound to uphold. Again, I mean, the KPRF make this point constantly, and I mean, I only put stock in law as much as it can ever be backed up by force. But it's worth emphasizing again, Yeltsin had absolutely no mandate to do that. Neither did Kravchuk, neither did Sheshkovich. Again, they were bound to, even by the laws of the time, implement the referendum result of 1991. But again, they signed the end of the USSR with absolutely no regard to any law or any democratic accountability. It was a fiat, it was a diktat, passed from the top with no reference to anybody else. Again, there were those at the time who said that Gorbachev should have stopped it, but he was already out of power. He was president of nothing at that stage. All power had passed to Yeltsin. And so that marked the end. And it was a process, really, that probably became irreversible after 1989. You started to see the big problems start in 88 with the unrest in Armenia, made worse by the earthquake in Armenia at the time, which, by all accounts, Gorbachev made a hash of dealing with because he was an incredibly incompetent administrator. He was good at bullshitting. That's all he was good at. Was very ineffectual administrator. That played into the hands of the Armenian separatists, and then you got the blow up in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is blamed largely on the Azerbaijanis. I'm going to say it's a little bit more of a complicated situation. Much like with the breakup of Yugoslavia, there's a lot of counter-revolutionaries at work there, including Gorbachev himself. We should probably do more on that in future episodes. But after 88 and the explosion of petty nationalisms in places like Armenia and Georgia and the Baltic states, and Gorbachev absolutely refuses to deal with this in any real serious way. He just lets it blow up. So essentially, at every stage after 1987, Gorbachev is when things blow up, he opts for the worst possible option. He allows, I think deliberately, the counter-revolutionary forces to gather strength. At no point did, other than in Kazakhstan, I think there was the riots in Kazakhstan in 86, where he was obliged to send in the Soviet army to quell them. After 87, whenever there is any kind of blow-up, any kind of separatism, he takes the option of doing nothing and allowing the counter-revolutionary forces to grow in strength and confidence. Doesn't mobilize the party against them. Doesn't mobilize the workers, the communist workers against them. Doesn't mobilize even the state forces against them. Doesn't even do what the leadership in China did in 1989. Now, for a counter-revolution to succeed in the way that this did, it succeeded because it never ran into any serious opposition. The men that led the state consciously decided to not oppose any of this. They did so screaming about democracy and freedom, of course, but these were deliberate choices that were being made here. They knew or had to understand on some level. Someone like Kryuchkov, who's a bullshit artist but not stupid, had to understand that by allowing Georgian Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian separatism and Armenian separatism to grow and grow in terms of strength and remain unchallenged, coming to the point where they were essentially prepared to declare that they were going to secede from the Soviet Union, and even then Gorbachev only puts up token resistance against that. So this counter-revolution succeeded because the very top of the state itself, the party in the state, actively colluded with it. It's the only conclusion you can actually draw, is that the counter-revolution succeeded because the leadership of the party wanted it to succeed, and they allowed it to grow. I will now address a comment in the chat here, who says, "Is it worth the pile of bodies?" Well, the pile of bodies you refer to there would have come from the crushing of a counter-revolution. How many bodies can you count in the 1990s? This is to Divested Sister in the chat. How many bodies piled up then? Millions. Millions died prematurely because of poverty, because of alcoholism, because of drug abuse, because of demoralization coming from the collapse of the state, and this collapse of health services, the collapse of industry. Even Putin says that the effects on the Russian population were like a civil war. So people say, "Oh my God, it's not worth it. We can't repress people to save the system." Well, here's the choice: you either repress the counter-revolutionaries who are actively trying to destroy working class power, who are actively trying to destroy socialism and condemn millions to death in the 1990s and up to this time, because the bodies incurred by the collapse of socialism are still piling up. What do you think the situation in Ukraine is all about? Where do you think that comes from? The bodies are still piling up in Ukraine and Russia right now, directly because of the counter-revolution in 1991 and because of the influence of imperialism. So people who say, "Oh, it's not worth fighting for this, that, or the other. It's not worth killing anybody. It's not worth, you can't repress people," that is a thoroughly bourgeois and ridiculous point of view. Again, like we come back to the great quote from Mark Twain, who says that there's two types of terror. There's the open terror of the guillotine or the bullet, the terror wielded by the proletariat to defend its revolution. And then there's the terror of the counter-revolutionaries, which includes a lot of direct violence themselves. And then also comes the terror of the counter-revolution in terms of the class war waged on the Soviet working classes all the way through the 90s, which racked up a gigantic pile of corpses and continues to do so to this day. So think again about your comments when you're backing up the Gorbachev line there. And Zuleika makes a good point, not to mention all the women who were trafficked into the sex trade. That's very true. The number of Russian, Ukrainian, and other nationalities of the Soviet system, the women who were like trafficked into prostitution in the West, was fucking astonishing and disgusting. And by the way, you can track the degeneration of the Soviet Union by when they kept importing like Western concepts such as fucking beauty contests and like pseudo pornographic magazines, that kind of thing. That started in like the late 60s into the 70s, and you could just track the degeneration that way. So the gigantic amount of social murder that takes place in the 1990s, again, that even Putin has admitted to, far outstrips anything that would have taken place in like 88, 89, 90, had the leadership actually acted as they were constitutionally obligated to do so and defend the system that they were supposed to lead. Instead of which they collapsed it and caused millions upon millions to die and continue to die up to this day. So don't come here with this fake morality and this hand-wringing. Gorbachev is the monster that they all accuse Stalin of being. So the point here to make is that after the Belavezha Accords, again completely illegal, Yeltsin, of course, then replaces the USSR with the fake CIS organization, which is still lingering around for, out of habit more than anything else, and then declares essentially that the Soviet system is all over. And again, like, I think that many people in the Soviet Union didn't expect what happened next to happen, which is that the divisions, the country not only disappeared, but then the divisions between the former component parts of it continued to grow. And of course, Yeltsin carries through multiple privatizations in '92 and into '93, which are blocked, or the Supreme Soviet, which still existed, attempted to block them. And this leads to Black October in 1993, which is a revolt generated by the Soviets themselves and the representatives in the Supreme Soviet, who Yeltsin blew it up in the name of democracy. After the revolt and after Rutskoy, who had been an ally of his in the late 80s, was forced into essentially assuming the presidency. Again, he didn't want to lead a revolt, but he was compelled to do so. Incidentally, this is where the abusive term Red-Brown Alliance comes from, because it was communists and certain Russian nationalists who were opposing Yeltsin at the time, though he still had the support of a number of fascist organizations, Yeltsin did. So every time Yeltsin did something big, especially privatization, destruction of what was left of the planned economy, it was all done contrary to the laws under which he was elected. Every time he did something, he screamed about democracy, whilst actually the only thing he was really doing was solidifying bourgeois rule in Russia. And here we will turn back to the democracy question, because here the question arises about, well, why on earth was it that the Soviet Union got infested with this garbage idea about the sacredness of bourgeois democracy? And again, there's two errors, well, a number of errors, but there's two principal failures here. One is the treachery of Khrushchev, who basically, as we've already covered, sought to push the working class out of power, or start the process of doing so. So once you start doing that, then you have essentially abandoned proletarian democracy, and you've declared that there is no class war in the Soviet Union anymore. Again, a complete opportunist lie. But also the failure comes in our old friends, the communist parties of the West. The communist parties of the West were in a position where they could deliver proper critiques of so-called bourgeois democracy. They kept failing to do so, though. Why? Because they had become essentially social democrats in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Britain, and elsewhere. These all became social democratic parties, and they did so and bought into the bourgeois system. And so, whereas what they should have been doing was preparing essentially for the moment when the social compromises of the post-1945 era broke down, they bought into them and continued to defend bourgeois democracy and defended it in social democratic terms. So where the Soviet Union had counter-revolutionary influences from the inside and counter-revolutionary influences from the outside in the form of the communist parties of the West, all of which became, because they became social democratic parties, were all supported bourgeois democracy. They did not defend the concepts and the practice of proletarian democracy, and what they should have been doing was consistently making the point of about the superiority of proletarian democracy. Even the compromised and revisionist form that existed in the USSR after Stalin, it was still superior to what was in the West, and they should have been forcefully making that case, but they failed to do so over and over again. They failed to take the opportunities to break open the contradictions in the bourgeois, in the imperialist systems of the West when they presented themselves, because they'd become social democrats. So, and of course, they confirmed all this by all of them embracing Euro-communism in the later 1970s. So, the triumph of the social democrats, the liberals, the out-and-out reactionaries in the Soviet Union, again, not a surprise, because you had the rot from the inside and the rot from the outside. the entire communist movement globally, other than in like a few places like the DPRK, China to a degree, though there's arguments about the condition of the Chinese party, but there's still a strong revolutionary section of the Chinese party to this day. Cuba, Laos as well. But in the West, and to a large extent in the Soviet Union, the communist parties all just went rotten and all got led by pro-bourgeois elements, all became complacent, and then ultimately reactionary, and ultimately counter-revolutionary. Until by the early 1980s, the Communist Party of Great Britain is calling for a popular front with anti-Thatcher conservatives to preserve welfare capitalism. I shit you not, that's what they were doing. So that's the reason why you get such support for the sacredness of bourgeois democracy. Even the communists in the West stopped referring to it as bourgeois democracy, except in their more academically minded journals. They all came completely over to the idea that bourgeois democracy was the only form of democracy, which is a complete and criminal dereliction of duty as communists. Communists in the West should be foremost in developing and spreading awareness of proper critiques of what the bourgeois system actually is, including what so-called bourgeois democracy is. But they all failed to do this. So this is one of the reasons why there was no one to seriously oppose these ideas, even on the international basis, when they emerged in the USSR. So we now come to the point where it's we can sort of reflect more on the events that led to the triumph of the counter-revolution. Yeltsin, as I said previously, tries to carry through the counter-revolution with the active assistance of the US imperialists. His time in office is marked by continued clashes with the forces, not just of the working class, but also with the national bourgeois. And it's the national bourgeois who slowly start to work out in the later 90s that Yeltsin is an active servant of a foreign power, in this case US imperialism. And ultimately, after the crash of 98, Yeltsin is disempowered, and Putin emerges as the compromise candidate, but much more aligned with national bourgeois forces than with the out-and-out comprador forces, though I will still emphasize that those are still present. Right, okay, so going to take some comments and questions from the floor. Now, Bulging Battery says, Mao is the reddest sun in our hearts. Very true. Paul Mason, who joined us, says, looking forward to enjoying a bottle of scotch along with this historical analysis. Paul, we'd love to have you on the show. Don't be a stranger. Edward asks, did the Baltics serve as a jump-off point for Western support for all kinds of comprador elements, including for people like Yeltsin during the 88 to 91 events? I mean, the Baltics had always served as a gateway point and a potential weak point for the Soviet Union. And again, along with Ukraine, the Baltic states had a very extensive network of fascist exiles in the USA, Canada, and Britain, all of whom were trained for reinsertion into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia when the opportunity arose. So yes, they were a big point of entry for the imperialists as soon as the revolts, the nationalist organized revolts, began there. But again, that couldn't have succeeded without Gorbachev essentially destroying the very basis of the Soviet state. Edward asked, Boris Pugo, why was he killed? P.S. He was from the Latvian SSR. I don't know why Pugo was killed. I mean, I've only heard rumors, so I don't want to comment on a rumor. I mean, what I generally think about the assassinations after 91 was that those who got killed were those who knew something, whereas like Yanayev and people like that survived and went on to die of natural causes. Pugo, I think, was Minister of the Interior. So chances are he knew something that was potentially damaging. And I think maybe that might be why he was killed. But again, without knowing, I can't go further than speculation there. Edward also asked, why was Tukhachevsky killed? he was also a right-wing revisionist counter-revolutionary element. Yes, he was. He was killed because he was conspiring to carry out a military coup. That's why he was killed. I mean, he was put on trial, found guilty, and then was executed. And he had been conspiring with German intelligence since even before the rise of the Nazis, going all the way back to the Weimar period. He had extensive connections with Germany. He was part of the Trotsky conspiracy with the Germans that would have seen Stalin and the rest of the Soviet leaders killed, and Trotsky, perhaps Tukhachevsky, come in to replace them. And that the deal was that they would then turn the Soviet Union into essentially what Trotsky alleged Stalin was doing later on, which is that they would turn the Soviet Union into a supply camp for the Germans. That would be a place of raw resource extraction, and that would be the deal they would have with the Nazis. The Nazis would rampage around Europe, and what was left of the Soviet Union would supply them, ruled over by Trotsky and the likes of Tukhachevsky. So Tukhachevsky was guilty of what he was accused of. He wasn't just a right revisionist. He was a traitor and got a traitor's death. No, and to answer the last part of your question, Edward, he wouldn't have been more useful during the Great Patriotic War. One of the reasons why they were able to win the Great Patriotic War was because they did purge the military leadership. They did purge the party leadership of a genuine network of fifth columnists, traitors and terrorists, the existence of whom was proved by Grover Furr's research, amongst others, when they looked into Trotsky's correspondence, which confirmed that Trotsky ran an underground organization in the Soviet Union and was dedicated to terrorism and sabotage. So no, he wouldn't have been any good leaving him alive during the Great Patriotic War, because he was a traitor, and he would have served his true master, which was Hitler. Greetings to Grassy Knoll in Seattle, Washington, and to Otis and to James Graham. Tim Gray wants a program on the Soviet Union in the 30s. I'll add it to the list, comrade. Greetings to Abtin, who asks, it's one thing that Gorbachev wasn't expelled. What led up to his appointment in the first place? The bureaucracy of Brezhnev led to this sad development. Gorbachev was one of the proteges of Andropov. Now, he was essentially a yes man. I mean, this is the thing about him. He was a skilled bullshit artist and a yes man, and he was the youngest member of the Politburo, and he was clearly backed by some more powerful figures. Now, I would need to do some more research into exactly what got him into position in the first place, but part of it was his youth. Part of it was the fact that he was one of Andropov's proteges, and Andropov was still very well thought of at the time. And he was able to use those two factors, I think, to increase his support. There's some dirty tricks involved as well. In fact, this is probably something for a whole other episode. But yes, we should probably look at the rise of Gorbachev. But the fact that he got in is one thing. The fact that he wasn't removed when he kept refusing to properly enforce the laws of the state, when he kept blocking any attempt to crush separatism or to defend the Soviet Union, and he kept capitulating to imperialism whilst getting nothing in return. All of that should have led to his removal via the mechanisms that were in place. The Politburo should have declared no confidence in him, and he should have been removed. Why that didn't happen, there were moves to do it. Why he kept getting away with it, these are questions which need to be visited. But Kieran and Kenny's posit the idea that, again, like, he made sure that anybody who with the authority to oppose him was sidelined, and that the Politburo, even those who were opposed to what he was doing, were just incompetent. They were incompetent and cowardly men who were not revolutionaries, who didn't have the stomach for a political battle. There you go. I mean, it might be as simple as that, but more research needed, definitely. Greetings to Svetlana in Moscow, and Arnold in windy Bridlington, and Irish Partisan, who joins us from Minsk. Jerry joins us from Hampshire. Greetings to Albert, who wants to exile the ruling class to the Gobi Desert. Still too generous. I'd say we're looking at off-planet solutions. The moons of Jupiter sound good. Comrade Ian Foster, greetings to you. Kawabi joins us from the vassal state of Denmark. Luca is with us, as is More Time Needed from Skegness, UK. Svetlana says, Stalin was a genius and the leaders who came after were relative dunces. How we are to square this with the great men of history theory versus history from below. It's not just a case of Stalin being a genius, Svetlana, even though Stalin was a great man. It's that Stalin was a creation of the Leninist period. He was a phenomenally well-read and well-studied Marxist who developed the theory and practice of Leninism considerably himself after Lenin's death. He and others had been tested over and over again, literally in battle. It's not just the fact that Khrushchev was an idiot, even though he was. It's the fact that the Politburo, by the time Stalin died, had degenerated. It had degenerated after World War II, in that there were, as Molotov explained to Felix Chuev in the sort of semi-biography that that Chuev did of Molotov, that people like Mikoyan and people like Khrushchev himself and others such as trying to think of who else was involved now, others such as, well, even Molotov admitted that he'd stopped studying the works of Marx, Engels, and Lenin by the time Stalin died. So the key movers in the Khrushchev era, Khrushchev himself, Mikoyan, Malenkov, etc., all of these people had, again, stopped their political development. They'd fallen into, consciously or otherwise, forms of opportunism. Whereas Stalin remained a student of Marxism his entire life. All of these other characters, I don't know about Kaganovich, whether he did or not, but the fact that they'd all stopped studying was a big problem. They all stopped developing themselves as revolutionaries. They ceased, I think, to see themselves as revolutionaries. Whereas in the 30s and into the 40s, even like the CIA admitted that the people in the party leadership conducted themselves consistently as revolutionaries. I think in the later 40s and early 50s that stopped. I think they really started seeing themselves as administrators. And so whereas Khrushchev comes across as a bit of a dummy and an opportunist, and Brezhnev admitted that he never studied anything either. Again, this is a part of the problem, but again, even that's part of a much bigger problem. And the much bigger problem is that the leaders saw themselves not as leaders of a revolutionary movement, but as administrators. I mean, that's what really the theory of the state of all the people means. What the theory of developed socialism under Brezhnev means. It means that, as I said before, it means that struggle has ceased. That's what Khrushchev was saying. It's what Brezhnev was trying to reaffirm, that there was no more struggle in the Soviet Union. Of course there was. Again, Mao was right. Class struggle intensifies after the victory of the revolution. And again, we go back to Marx, who insisted it would be at least 2 generations before of the dictatorship of the proletariat being in place before you could even start to think about declaring any kind of victory. But again, like Khrushchev and the others were fundamentally bureaucrats in their mindset. They wanted a peaceful system. They wanted a deal with imperialism. They wanted to be left to develop capitalism in the Soviet Union, essentially. It's, again, the same plan as Bukharin had. Same plan that the Tukhachevsky and Trotsky conspiracy had. Each of them, going all the way up to Gorbachev and Yeltsin, basically came up with the same ideas over and over again, which is that they would essentially capitulate to imperialism, declared that the socialism and the class struggle were over, and that they would take their place in a unified Europe, a Europe unified by imperialism, and that the Soviet Union would serve, or Russia, later Russia would serve, as a site of raw resource extraction. That was the plan, fundamentally, of Bukharin. That was the plan of Trotsky in his conspiracies with the Nazis. That was the plan that developed later in the 70s, especially with the discovery of more oil and gas deposits in the Soviet Union. The plan was that they were going to essentially unite with Europe by pipeline politics. And again, that necessitated making loads of concessions to imperialism to get those oil and gas deals. And again, Gorbachev's idea was, well, we'll have a unified Europe all the way from Calais to Vladivostok, and the Soviet Union will integrate into this unified Europe by selling it oil and gas. Same plan, by the way, that Putin was defending as late as 2007. Again, it's the same comprador idea over and over again from Bukharin onwards. That the fate that which is end the class struggle, turn the Soviet Union into an appendage of imperialism, and therefore will be allowed to peacefully develop if we're not a threat to them. Again, always the same ideas, and it comes back to the fact that in the 20s and 30s, the Bukharinists were able to be repressed because a proper policy was followed, because there were, again, strong links to the masses, between the party and the masses and the state. And again, once that stopped, though, then the counter-revolution grows in strength and strength, and its forces grow in strength. So yes, I hope I've answered your question there, Svetlana. If I haven't, I'm happy to talk at greater length. Good evening to Almir, Frida, and Lee. Greetings to Fridge Stalker from Michigan, and to Zuleika, and to Sean. Divested Sister says brutalism is ugly, and you couldn't be more wrong. Brutalism has a real beauty to it. Ocean 2035 says, stopping the mobilization and politicization of the working class in anti-imperialism, both during and after the revolution, would mean the end of the anti-imperialist movement and the revolution itself. This is the key to the revolution. This is a key to keep the revolution going. Yes. Jeremy Turner says, the piece of the puzzle I do not understand is how there could be such a reversal in awareness of forces of power at the death of Stalin. Was there a coup or a power vacuum? Well, I hope I've answered that question when my response to Svetlana's point. I think there was a coup in the Soviet Union in the 50s. I think it was Khrushchev's coup. It led to the death of Beria and the expulsion from the party of the so-called anti-party group, which was included Molotov and Kaganovich. So I think there was something of a coup in the Soviet Union that brought the revisionist clique to power and kept them there. Again, as to what caused the death of Stalin, I don't know enough about the competing theories on that. But there was something of a coup, and again, comes back to political degeneration of the senior levels as well. That was a big part of it. Irish Partisan says, the overthrow of the socialist system in Romania with the execution of Ceausescu was a textbook counter-revolution by revisionist elements within the Romanian Communist Party. Ceausescu, like Milosevic, is being vindicated. Yeah, because whatever flaws and mistakes Ceausescu had and made, the fact that what happened to Romania after his overthrow and murder has confirmed that the socialist period in Romania, for all the problems that it did have, was far better than what they've got now, which is a country which is having the life drained out of it by imperialism. And the only plan the imperialism has for Romania is to turn it into an armed encampment on the edge of Russia. The same plan the Nazis had for it, by the way. Tim Gray says, I hate to use this term, but the Soviet people had a shock doctrine carried out on them, which was engineered to stop any real fight back to save the Soviet Union. I don't use that term. I know you say you don't want to use it either, comrade. It again, Naomi Klein came up with this apparently new term for just how imperialism operates anyway. But again, what stopped the fight back? What stopped any fight to save the Soviet Union wasn't the later collapse of the economy or anything like that. It was political degeneration of revisionism since the 50s. That's what caused the Soviet Union ultimately to collapse, because there was no force organized enough to actually save it. Even though there was a will there to do so, there was no leadership in place, and that is the failure of revisionism over the long term. It disempowered the working class. So it was again old methods, but carried out in a new way. Almir says, demobilizing the masses is disastrous. Accusing many innocent people of being rightist, counter-revolutionary, etc. in an unscientific way is also not good. Purge has to be done the right way with evidence. During the Cultural Revolution, many innocent people suffered from what I read. Still researching the Cultural Revolution. Look, this isn't going to be a clean process. The revolutions tend to be, well, rather imprecise at certain points. The purges in the 1930s went wrong at certain points, but I would argue that both the purges in the 1930s and the Cultural Revolution in the 60s were successes to a certain degree, not successes in an unqualified way, but certainly in terms of destroying treacherous and revisionist cliques. Certainly in the 30s that worked, and they were in China in the 60s. They were set back as well, and I would argue the long-term positive benefits of that are what helped to preserve China in 1989. Na says, if the Soviet Union had a cultural revolution, it would still be around. Quite possibly. Quite possibly. Hello to Jenny, who has joined us. Just scrolling down. Hello to everybody who's come into the chat. I'm sorry I can't greet you all, but good to have you with us. 337 of you joining live. Zuleika says, one of the first things notorious degen hellhole Las Vegas when the special military operation started was to put up a strip of billboards saying now recruiting Ukrainians. Oh, I bet they are. I bet they are. I mean, it is the most properly sickening thing. When you hear somebody saying how much they support Ukraine, it's like, no, you don't. You support Ukraine being turned into a living hell, and support the hyper-exploitation of its now stateless people forced into exile. I mean, it's just the most sickening, disgusting thing that these people engaged in. Edward says, could the Baltic nationalists and separatists have been suppressed and Baltics reintegrated into the USSR? If they'd acted properly in 88, then maybe. But the fact is that not just in the Baltics, but in Georgia and Ukraine, they'd been allowing these people to grow since the 50s. Again, Khrushchev turned loose thousands of people who were rightly imprisoned because of their crimes in World War II and in the long period of the anti-Banderite war between 45 and 52. So again, it all comes back to a failure, which was the counter-revolutionary attempt by Khrushchev, successful attempt by Khrushchev to remove the dictatorship of the proletariat, to declare that to be over. And so that's not just simply a matter of using the repressive organs of the workers' state against reactionaries, so that is part of it. It also goes back to politicization and mobilization of the masses. Is the party in Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, or Ukraine, is it waging a serious and sustained campaign against petty bourgeois nationalism? And the answer after the 60s is that they're really not. There's administrative measures taken against various nationalists if they step out of line too much, but the networks that are built by those internal and external enemies in Ukraine, the Baltic states, Georgia, etc., those networks grow and grow through the 60s and 70s and aren't seriously struggled against. So the party sort of sits there allowing all of this stuff to grow, and it reaches a point of no return. So again, even before Gorbachev, they're allowing it to grow because they're not waging an active struggle against it, because these are scared bureaucrats who are running things now. They don't want to mobilize the Soviet working class in a serious way. And they are therefore prepared to sit there and watch the growth of counter-revolutionary tendencies because they're much more afraid of mobilizing the working class than they are of the growth of Baltic or Georgian or Ukrainian petty reactionary nationalism. Scott asks, was the collapse of the USSR somewhat inevitable after Khrushchev's anti-Stalin, anti-Marxist Leninist reforms? Don't know about inevitable then, as I think it could have been saved in one form or another up to quite late in the day. But that was the beginning point, to answer your question. That was the beginning of the fall. Krasavet says, the West has never suffered like Eastern Europe. Not for a long time. You're right about that. Dad, apparently, says, I thought the August coup was going to be about Biden. Hey, man, I've been cooled out just like that Gorbachev fella. Only the further thing is, I ain't dead. At least I think not. Not yet, anyhow. And we await the future words of future Health and Human Services Secretary Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. Svetlana says, Gorbachev had every possible privilege in the USSR even before he became head of state. He clearly wanted to grind the Soviet Union into dust. Why he should want to do that puzzles me. Well, I mean, I think a key person to understand here is Yakovlev. Yakovlev, again, we're talking kind of speculation. I've read some things about him that indicate that he had turned pro-capitalist as early as the 50s. He hid this behind an ultra-left face for a while. He was also, I think, ambassador to Canada, Yakovlev, in the 70s. So he had a long time to be in the 50s and the 70s to be exposed to the influence of Western intelligence agencies. I think it's definitely the case that Yakovlev was an asset of American imperialism. Whether he was on the direct payroll of the CIA or not is another question. But he was a collaborator with imperialism probably from the 50s onwards. So I think for a guy like that, and given that he was so crucial in terms of what Gorbachev did, because Yakovlev, remember, got appointed as head of propaganda, and he turned the state media against the Communist Party itself. This is forgotten in the West now completely, even if it was ever covered at all. Yakovlev turned the news organs of the state against communism, against socialism, and against the Communist Party. Now, there were those inside the US imperialist system who had a very good understanding of the Soviet system and knew some of what they had to do to blow it up. I think recruiting Yakovlev was a stroke of genius on their part, because there you got somebody who, again, for whatever reason, had become an active but hidden anti-communist from the 1950s onwards. And he did understand what he was doing. He knew what he had to do to blow up the system. Now, even with the full control of the propaganda networks, he couldn't destroy the will of the Soviet people who wanted to continue with the Soviet system. But he could convince enough of the so-called intelligentsia, who were some of the stupidest, most self-indulgent and foolish people that the Soviet Union had to offer. I mean, I think he was the first president of post-1991 Georgia. I forget his name now. Who he'd had a really good, decent life as a poet. subsidized by the Soviet state, turned against it and destroyed it. And I think he died in poverty. So like the many of these people, these so-called intelligentsia types, who turned against the Soviet system in the 70s and the 80s, who became pro-capitalist, like a lot of them who remained as artists ended up being very poor under the new system, because like whereas they got a subsidized, they were subsidized by the state to carry out art, to do artistic work prior to the counter-revolution, they lost all that with it. So they ended up, some of them ended up making themselves worse off. But Yakovlev's propaganda was designed to essentially win over this layer of rather dumb, self-indulgent, cowardly intelligentsia types, and win them over. And those were the people in Moscow and Leningrad in '91 who were voting to end the Soviet Union, who were backing up Yeltsin. So Yakovlev is one of the key figures to look at. Abalkin, Leonid Abalkin, I think the other guy's name is, who was another economic advisor to Gorbachev. He's another one to look into. I think these guys were definitely as virulent a collection of anti-communists as Solzhenitsyn himself. And yet again, these were the people in the hierarchy of the party. These rats should have been flushed way before they actually were. They were clearly engaged in a counter-revolutionary conspiracy and had been for a long time. So why on earth were they still walking around? Yakovlev's past should have been suspicious to anybody. He'd been in the West for quite a long period of time. He'd adopted like ultra-left points of view at various points before becoming an ultra-right-winger. Very suspicious character. Should never have been given charge of anything, and yet he was. So that's a guy that needs to be looked into seriously, because I'm convinced that he was an asset of American imperialism and had been since the 50s. Krasovet says in the 80s, Todor Zivkov gave more power to the cooperatives and started decentralizing. That was his plan before being ousted. Yeah, well, I need to do more research on Bulgaria. I think that the Zivkov period needs to be dealt with more seriously than I have the knowledge to do so right now. I think the fate of the people's democracies was tied up with the Soviet Union, because without the Soviet Union there to defend them, they came under threat from direct intervention in one way or the other from the imperialists. So as soon as the plug got pulled in the Soviet Union, it was unfortunately inevitable that similar things were going to happen in the East. Risto Kostadinov said, I remember during my reactionary days I hated the left, mainly because the Social Democrats privatized most of the stuff after the fall of Yugoslavia. Well, that's how a lot of people started like hating the left, even in Britain, because they associate the left with the Labour Party. They associate socialism with Tony Blair. And say, well, if he's socialism, I'll go and be, the opposite. I'll go and be a reactionary, because you're not encouraged, of course, to learn about Marxism-Leninism or actual communism. You're encouraged to view the left as like the pathetic, treacherous, scumbag social democrats. And if you thought that was socialism, it's no surprise that so many people turn reactionary when they think that that's what socialism is. Rista says, it took me good 4 years educating myself and reflecting on my reactionary tendencies. Well, educating ourselves is a lifelong process, and reflecting on our reactionary tendencies is something that we should all do, because especially those of us who grow up in imperialist countries, because we're immersed in a reactionary culture from the first day of our lives. Luca asks, very interesting two-part live stream. How will the Ukrainian defeat impact the other former USSR countries? Answering in brief, Luca, it'll push them, it'll undermine the pro-Western forces there, but all of these countries are still very much split between China, Russia on the one hand, and the West on the other. I mean, you look at a country like Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan, that's got both of them have very extensive investments from British imperialism and US imperialism in them. So they've been playing both sides of this for quite some time. Eventually, some sort of choice will be forced usually by the imperialists. So what they do then will be another question. But certainly the power of US imperialism will be damaged by this defeat. Not destroyed, though. The power of US imperialism lies ultimately in the amount of capital it can move around, and it can still move around quite a lot of capital, more so than almost anyone else other than the Chinese. So their power is damaged, but they're not going to just disappear. More on that when we come back to the multipolarity question later this week. Greetings to Clinton, who says, was there such a thing as Nazbols? Never quite got it, but was this a Russian thing? Well, that was the national Bolsheviks that were founded by the novelist Eduard Limonov and Dugin. So yes, they were a real thing. How serious they were is another question. I'd need to do more research into it. I tend not to take Dugin particularly seriously. Hello to the Risen People era, who joins us from Ireland. Svetlana says, a friend of my mother's worked on Chernomyrdin's team in the 96 elections. She sat in the same Moscow office as two CIA men who oversaw the office's work. Yeah, like the American imperialists ran all of Yeltsin's guys. Their mission was to deliver Russia into being essentially a semi-colony of the United States. That's the only form of Russia that the U.S. imperialists are prepared to accept. So, like, it's just laughable when you hear like Yeltsin babbling on about Russia. It's like, yeah, you wanted to sell it off down to the last screw, mate. You know. Almir raises an interesting question. I know that the CPC is very strong and that there is zero chance of any kind of counter-revolution in the near future, but I still feel like the Chinese working class is not really mobilized. It's an interesting point, Almir. I mean, I'm going into this at the moment myself, so I'll return to address that question when we come to more live streams on China, because you raise a good point. No, to answer Paul Mason's point, the Liz Truss demise program is still coming up. Abtin says, all of Gorbachev's complacency can be an indication that he was compromised and possibly hoisted into power by comprador forces. There's something very suspicious about all of it. There is indeed. More information needed. Scrolling through the comments. Struggle never ends, says On Burlo, and On Burlo is correct. Yeah, we will, to answer Jeromeo Prescott's point, there will be videos upcoming on the Cultural Revolution when I've finally finished the research on it. Comrade Jason Turvey joins us and asks, what practical methods could have been deployed to ensure that those that inherited leadership in socialist states remain connected to the revolution that birthed them? Well, it's an interesting question. It's partially about setting in place a good internal regime, which the Bolshevik Party had in the 20s and 30s. It's about making sure also that at each stage, the cadres that are promoted to the senior leadership levels aren't promoted based on supposed administrative skill, but that if they've got that, then that's good. But I think one of the big things that went wrong in the Soviet Union was that they were promoting politically weak people for quite some time. I think even in the Stalin period, this was a problem. So again, some of it comes down to education. Some of it comes down to actually having a better process in place for who goes into leadership positions. The other part, the most practical part, to answer your question, Jason, the element that can be put in place comes down to the masses themselves. comes down to how strong the party can be at the base level, meaning that the biggest guarantee against a rotten leadership is a politicized, class-conscious working class that is the core of which, the intellectuals of which, are the rank and file cadre of the Communist Party, who are consistent revolutionaries and who understand that their job is to link the mass, be the link point between the masses and the leadership, and to be able to identify when the leadership has gone rotten or when it is going rogue. Now, that comes from education. It comes from, again, having your base level cadre be as important as the Central Committee, the Political Bureau. Because if you have the base level cadre in place, who can, again, build those consistent links with the masses, and who can be taking politicization to the masses consistently, and who are imbued with the spirit, I would say, of the that birthed the Cultural Revolution, meaning there needs to be an attitude fostered in the base of the party and from them in the wider working class, that if the leadership is going rogue, if it's become bourgeois, and again, there are ways in which you can responsibly identify if it is doing so, then at a certain point you need to be able to pull the Mao card, so to speak, and basically enable the base of the party to carry out essentially a rebellion against the counter-revolutionary elements in the party itself. And that means bombard the headquarters, to use Mao's phrase. But go back to 1991. Okay, let's say there's a slightly healthier regime in place in the Soviet Union. Stronger cadres who are prepared to act as Che Guevara thought cadres should act, which is that they are responsible for taking the line of the party and implementing it in a way that suits the conditions in which they are working. That they have a degree of independence of operation, as long as it's within the line decided by the party, but also that they understand that their role is to also check a leadership that goes rotten. And so to mobilize, to be able to effectively mobilize the working class against a rotten leadership, even within the Communist Party itself, by doing things like revolutionary strikes if the leadership has gone rogue, and to enable the workers to identify when the leadership has gone rogue. And again, this needs to be built into party organization. You need to be building in that your men and women at the ground level, your everyday, the communist, card-carrying communists who are workers or who are in the trade unions, or who are workers in even in the intellectual realm, are constantly aware of the mood of the masses, and also are constantly trying to politicize the masses further, to bring on as many worker Bolsheviks, shall we say, as possible, who are prepared to get out there and actually haul down leaders who go as rogue as Gorbachev did, or as rogue as Khrushchev did. And again, let's go back to 1991. The only thing that really could have stopped the counter-revolution at that stage, if the state forces weren't being used because the leadership was opposed to them being used, the only thing that could have stopped the gathering pace of the counter-revolution would have been a nationwide general strike organized by worker communists with the specific purpose of, shall we say, defending the March 1991 referendum result. The workers will strike until those who are seeking to destroy the system and undermine socialism in the USSR are removed. And that means Gorbachev and that means Yeltsin. But to do that, you need the strongest worker Bolsheviks possible at the base level of the party. And I think that one of the biggest reasons why the Soviet Party went rotten was because so many of them, those people who led from the bottom led the drive to industrialization in the 5-year plan in the 1930s. Why was the why were the 5-year plans so successful? It's because it's not just because Stalin was a genius, even though I insist that he was. It's because there were millions and millions of workers across the Soviet Union who played their part in shaping the 5-year plan, then took ownership of it and made sure it was implemented in their factory, in their localities, in their mines, in all the different areas of industry and agriculture. It was the worker Bolsheviks that were leading the charge. And many of them, the younger ones, were the first to perish, or those who perished in the highest numbers in the Great Patriotic War. So, like, the best of them had died after 1945. And I think that really does show those who were the most heroic, the most dedicated to building a proper Leninist culture, which is what I've just described I would regard as a proper Leninist culture, had been killed, and they had to rapidly recruit to replace them. And I don't think that it looks like to me that they didn't recruit discerningly enough, perhaps, and didn't educate enough people up to the requisite level. And so by the time that Stalin dies, he's surrounded by ill-educated, non-Marxist administrators who looked for easy answers, and the easy answers were provided by the pro-imperialist comprador elements that existed inside the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev, being a bit of a fool who liked easy answers, was given one by the comprador elements in the USSR and the actively treacherous elements, and who said, look, denounce revolution, stop all this business of supporting revolts against the imperialists, even though they had to backtrack on that in the end. Declare to the USA that it's all over, that you're not going to fight them anymore, that you've turned your backs on revolution, and that will stop this gathering Cold War that we're in. And Khrushchev's able to get away with it because, again, there's not enough people at the base of the party who are prepared to essentially recognize this for what it was and lead an appropriate revolt, shall we say. A spirit of revolt has to be there in the working class base of the party. The workers not only have to understand themselves as the rulers of the country, but have to have within them the spirit of, well, what Mao tried to cultivate in the Cultural Revolution to varying degrees of success, which is that, again, take something from bourgeois philosophy. The bourgeois always have taken the attitude that if a certain set of leaders don't suit our class interests, we'll get fucking rid of them. That's what, I'm being very crude there, but that's what John Locke and people like the Enlightenment philosophers all believed. The philosophers of the rising bourgeois all believed. It's what social contract theory is partly about for the bourgeois, that if you as the ruler do not fulfill your contract with us as the ruling class, then we'll get rid of you. I think the similar attitude needs to be cultivated in workers after the revolution, which is, this is our dictatorship. This is the dictatorship of the proletariat, us. And therefore, if you are trying to dismantle that, no matter what number of fancy words you are using, then we reserve the right to revolt against you, bombard the headquarters, and get rid of you. And I think that is the way that I would seek to address the points you raised there. Feel free to message me or email me if you think the answer needs to be expounded upon, Jason. Trot's love to purity test, says Gerardo. Funny with everything you mentioned about Nazi collaboration. That is indeed the case. Right, just scrolling through. I'm going to need to call this to a close in a minute. Just pick up on. Apparently, the Kiev regime, says Irish Partisanos, demanded that that Lukashenko withdraw Belarus forces from the border with Ukraine. Yeah, I really imagine that Lukashenko is going to say yes to that shit, you know? I mean, it's just the desperate sounding off. President Jesus says, wait a minute, is he saying that RFK Jr. and Trump aren't going to stick it to the establishment? Well, I'll conclude I'll conclude with an RFK Jr. impression.
the only way you can really stick it to the establishment is to be part of it to the point where you're a regular on Little St. James Island. That's the way you really stick it to them.
Etc. And with that, more on that tomorrow. I'm going to have to bring it to a close for this evening. Thanks to all 359 of you watching. And thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon on Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back again with you on Tuesday because I'll be doing other things tomorrow. Back with you on Tuesday with the latest from the Kursk incursion and the war in Ukraine, or the war on Ukraine, I should say, by NATO. Again, have a good bank holiday Monday if you're in Britain. This show will be up on Patreon tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in. Back with you again soon.